Welcome, everyone. I'm Karen Greenberg. I direct the Center on National Security at Fordham Law, and welcome to today's event on the book I'm going to show you, Homegrown, ISIS in America. But before we get started today, I want to mention some sad news in the world of the Center on National Security, my world. Frank Mead, who is a longtime friend, advocate for, and advisor to the center, passed away on November 1st of this year. And we're going to miss him. And so I wanted to take today to sort of dedicate this program to him and to honor his memory. I think his spirit will be with us for a long time. And I just wanted to mention him gratefully here as he's attended all of our virtual events up to this point. Today's event, as I said at the beginning, is meant to celebrate this wonderful new book with an amazing cover, which is why I showed it. There's so much going on the cover that we could have just spent today talking about the cover, like what are all these little post-its, but we won't. The author of the book, who's with us today, is Seamus Hughes. He wrote this book with Alexander Melagru Hitchens and Bennett Clifford. Seamus is one of the leading counterterrorism and terrorism experts in the country. He's been producing report after report for years, both for Congress and for others. Before joining the program on extremism at George Washington University, where he is the deputy director, he worked at the NCTC, the National Counterterrorism Center. Before that, he was a senior counterterrorism advisor on the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. So there's an awful lot, Seamus, we should be talking about today in our 1 hour, but I wanted to start with the book and then go on. For those of you in the audience, please feel free to send your questions into the Q&A, and I will get as many into the conversation as I can. But first, I just want to have a conversation with you, Seamus. And first, I want to talk about why now, this book. And so let me pause at something, then you tell me either why I'm right or why I'm wrong, which is that the real height of ISIS in the United States was 2014, 2015. We kept seeing cases in 2015 and 2016, but with the destruction of the caliphate and maybe some other things you want to mention, it's been kind of a here and there set of investigations, indictments, and prosecutions from a height of something in the, I think, over 50 cases a year. We've now seen something like, less than a dozen. So is that why you did the book now? Were you thinking maybe that the arc of ISIS in the United States, at least in this incarnation and the way we know it, is something we can tell the full story of? Doesn't mean it's gone away, or not?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Let me just first say thank you very much for having me. Karen, you've been a friend for a number of years, and the Center for National Security has been something that I've relied on in their reports for years now, and you put on a great event. So it's an honor to be here. And thank you for the kind words about Frank. It's also an honor to be part of this conversation on that day. The reason why we decided to put out a book on ISIS in 2020 as opposed to 2015 was the story wasn't written yet. Just yesterday, we had 2 new indictments unsealed in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania of a husband and wife that were sending money to family members to go join ISIS. And so if we wrote the book in 2015, I don't think we would have told the full picture. It takes a long time to get a sense of it. And for about 3 years, me and my co-authors traveled around the country interviewing FBI agents and defense attorneys and family members and individuals who came back from ISIS to get a sense of what it actually means when we say ISIS in America, right? It's almost like a loaded term, right? It's not, we shouldn't be alarmist about it. There's not people hiding in your bed trying to kill you for ISIS, right? But it's also not insignificant, right? So we wanted to wrap our head around it. And the only way to do that was to take a step back and look at it. So we looked at about 20,000 pages of legal documents. We filed a whole host of FOIAs, which we all got rejected and then appealed again and finally got them. We filed motions to unseal documents. And after a bit of time, people started talking, right? When time has passed, you're more willing to talk about that case in 2014 than you were at the height of it. And so if we wanted to do it justice, we wanted to give a little bit of distance.
So you did all of this, and I will say that the detail on these cases is quite impressive. And not just the detail on the cases themselves, but how the different indictments lead up to one another and the different individuals knew one another, both virtually and otherwise. And there were a number of things there that I hadn't quite realized in terms of relationship between those inspiring, those funding, those, planning attacks, those indicted. It's actually a very intricate presentation and portrait that you have. But in the aggregate, what did you learn? And I want to make that a little more specific. What did you learn? Let's start with what did you learn that surprised you once you got the FOIAs that you needed to get in terms of just how to describe the ISIS terrorist?
Yeah, I think the story of ISIS in America is stories of ones and twos and not fours and fives. You're talking about a relatively small phenomenon of individuals, usually friends, some level of in-person network, but not a large network like you would see in, say, parts of Europe, right? And so I think that's the first takeaway. And the second takeaway is, and you know this as well as I do, that there's not a typical profile of an ISIS recruit, right? They're old, they're young, they're rich, they're poor, they're black, they're white, they're converts and reverts, right? There's not really a rhyme or reason to why someone joins a terrorist organization. Now, they all share the same ideology and narrative, but they come after it differently. And the ways they get to it is completely different. The other thing, and I think the point you made about, if you pull back the onion a little bit, you realize there's a bit more connections than I think we give it credit to. A young man in Iowa is somehow connected to a guy that's part of a group of guys in Raqqa, right? And that connection is usually made over social media. But sometimes there's that in-person network like we saw in Minneapolis, St. Paul, where the brothers, sisters, and roommates of kids that joined al-Shabaab 5 to 10 years ago were the ones who came and joined ISIS. So I think if you just figure that all out, you get a sense that it's a very diverse and diffused threat picture.
And yet one of the things that you focus on that I guess not surprising because we've been reading, one of those reports for so long is the youth, how young they are. And the reason I bring that up is that I'd like you to compare that to two things. One is ISIS in Europe and elsewhere in the world, and two, to white supremacist extremism and what we're thinking now, because we're really talking in a number of these ISIS cases of individuals who are barely in their teens and often in their early 20s.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I was actually surprised by the number of minors we had in our case study. Not only the people that were arrested for criminal charges. We had an individual who was arrested when they were 15 and charged with material support, but that was an outlier. Most of the time, you had a number of minor cases where FBI agents would determine that they didn't want to bring a federal charge, or perhaps they couldn't get it through the National Security Division at the Department of Justice. But when you interview these agents, they'll say, like, I didn't really want to charge a 16-year-old for terrorism, and I didn't want him to spend 20 years in jail for that. And the lack of tools and abilities to do anything else besides that, I think, was mildly concerning on my end. And also, I think you saw an interesting trend now, particularly now, a step up of state and local officials charging at a state level. So you're seeing terroristic charges in Arizona and New Jersey and New York for minor cases, 17-year-olds. There's a case out of South Carolina of a 16-year-old got charged with a gun charge at the state level, spent 2 years in jail, got out, and then was charged again with material support terrorism when he's 18 for trying to join ISIS. Now, I think that's a failure of policy too, right? So you see these minors who are going down this path and not having options other than law enforcement, I think is a concern and something that policymakers should think about in any real substance.
So
now,
in terms of, I want to talk about that just before we go on, because you spent a lot of time thinking about counterviolent extremism prevention, however you want to term it, and there was a period at the end of the Obama administration where there was government funding for this, and there was kind of some robust efforts made. There are still a few things out there like DEP, but what happened? We don't hear about the terrorism CVE movement now, and I'm just sort of curious. What's your take on it? Did it just we got diverted and the funds dried up, or what happened?
There's a couple of reasons why. One, I think the sheer scope of the number of arrests in 2014-15 forced the administration to be creative. They couldn't arrest their way out of the problem. I think back to an assistant U.S. attorney I interviewed in New York, who used to sit around the table with a bunch of FBI agents, and they get their weekly briefing of cases. And after the couple weeks, he said, I don't have enough lawyers to charge all these individuals. We're going to have to figure out a different way. And so that was a forcing function in many ways. The Obama administration did spend a lot of time. They had a White House summit on counterviolent extremism. But if you really kind of dug into it, and I happened to be in government during some of that time, you're really just talking about 4 of my friends and me trying to implement a national strategy, right? That is not going to be particularly successful. And to be fair, there's a lot of concerns with counterviolent extremism programs, right? My civil rights and civil liberties colleagues would say, this is government overreach. This is policing extreme thoughts, and you shouldn't have a national program to do so. I think there's some truth in that. I don't think we need to have a $1 billion program on this, especially when the numbers are so small. But at the end of the day, if I'm sitting across the room from a parent who's concerned about their kid, and the only option I have is an arrest or do nothing and hope they grow out of the phase, I just think that's just a failure at a policy level and just a failure of society, right? We should provide some level of off ramps, but I think we can do that creatively in a way that doesn't, come across civil rights and civil liberties concerns. So narrowly tailoring this thing. Now, where do we go from here? I mean, listen, the Obama administration, largely tried it. The Trump administration came in with this grand plan to revamp it and change names. They basically changed counterviolent extremism to something called terrorism prevention. But it was the same program with less funding and less people. There's no built-in advocates for this program. From the right, you'll say, you're too soft on terror, you're hugging a terrorist. On the left, you'll say it's government overreach. And so there's no advocates in the middle. I'll be surprised if it really gets a shot in the arm in the Biden administration. Maybe perhaps on the white supremacist, neo-Nazi kind of anti-government side, which I think there's some room to do some counterviolent extremism programs. I don't see that necessarily happening in any real substance when it comes to ISIS or jihadism.
One of the things that's been the major tools in prosecuting terrorists has been the terrorism statutes, federal terrorism statutes. And one of the strengths of the terrorism statutes are the link to foreign organizations. In terms of ISIS and your description of this homegrown phenomenon, you want to talk about how it's different than how we thought about the international outreach of Al-Qaeda, and how much of this is actually about travel and training, as opposed to what was going on with Al-Qaeda, and how much that's changed, and what's happening with the foreign fighter phenomenon today.
That's one of the takeaways from the book is if you look at the cases in 2015, the 60 plus cases that were public, right? The vast majority involved some level of attempt to travel to overseas. So ISIS had a message and a product, right? The announcement of a so-called caliphate flipped a switch for American homegrown violent extremists, and they were drawn to that idea. And so you did see a push on that aspect of it. The difference between Al-Qaeda and ISIS is not only the message and the product, but the people, right? ISIS had the ability and time and space to reach out systematically to Americans and groom them over the course of weeks and months to encourage them to commit attacks. Think of a case up in upstate New York where a man in Raqqa, Sudani, was reaching out to another man with mental health issues about the need to commit an attack at a nightclub in upstate New York, right? This is an individual who I think without Sudani whispering in his ear probably would have gone a different way. Whereas Al-Qaeda would just put the message out to kind of a megaphone effect, throw it out there and hope it sticks. These guys were much more of a one-on-one intervention trying to push the message and action.
You have this term, virtual entrepreneurs.
Yeah. It's not going to stick, right? I've tried my best as an academic to make virtual entrepreneurs stick, but it's not going to. So let's just call it what everybody else does, which is virtual attack planners. There was 6 or 7 individuals in Raqqa. The FBI deemed them the Legion, internally called the Legion of Doom, very dramatic FBI fashion, right? These are individuals that were at a computer lab, changing phones back and forth and systematically reaching out to Americans here to commit attacks. And what would happen is, they had a level of prominence. Junaid Hussain would be a great example, a well-known British hacker who became an ISIS propagandist. And the Americans would reach out to them, and these guys in the Legion would reach back and say, you don't want to travel, it's too hard. What you want to do is commit an attack in the homeland, and let me make it easy for you. Here's the address of the military officer in your area. Here's a link on Amazon to the knife you want to use, and here's how to upload the video in order to behead the individual, and we'll claim credit for it, right? And so these guys were not necessarily saying, make sure you attack the Mall of America, but they were saying, wouldn't it be great if you attacked a mall? And let's make it a little bit easy for you to do that, right? And so it's a bit of a hand-holding. And in fact, when you look at the domestic plotting when we looked at the domestic plotting for the book, we found that more than half of the cases involved at least 6 of the individuals in the Legion, right? And so once those individuals were systematically killed by Department of Defense and Allied forces, that number of domestic plotting dramatically dropped in 2016.
Just sticking with the international conversation a little bit, you talk about the drawdown of troops in the region and the growth and contributing to the growth of ISIS with the chaos in Syria, right? So just, skipping forward to today and to the announcement this week about the drawdown of troops in the region, does it worry you in terms of a predicate for more terrorism, or are we in a different period of time? How would you weigh in on this?
Yeah, I think we're probably in a management time, which is, I don't see us having a clear victory, but I also don't see us having a clear defeat when it comes to this. We're a lot smarter than we were before. We got a sense of the network for ISIS now, and a lot of that has to do with the interviews that law enforcement did with returning foreign fighters. They get a sense of how these guys operate and how they take in folks. And so you're able to do targeted attacks or targeted strikes in a way you hadn't before. Is it always better to have folks on the ground to have intelligence and things like that? Absolutely. But I just don't see there's an appetite in this country or even our political parties to do so. And so I think we're probably going to see a similar thing to what we had in, say, Somalia, where the occasional strike when you have intelligence, but not really anything of real kind of substance. My concern really is you just don't want to let these guys grow back up again. The fact that they had this territory, they were able to intake thousands of foreign fighters in a way that no other terrorist organization had in the history. All right, so if you don't give them space, if they're worried about looking over their shoulder every day, that's a good thing for counterterrorism, right? And so I think it's just going to be a matter of playing this a little bit more smarter than we have in the past.
And then there's also the question of the camps. Mm-hmm. Where individuals are living in Syria, refugee camps, in some cases detention camps. This sense of a breeding ground for maybe new forms of terrorism, for ISIS itself. Do you think there's a way to handle this problem and address this problem? Are you worried about it? How do you take?
Yeah, listen, I'm worried about it from twofold. One is a general radicalization concern, right? You get enough people in a room who believe extreme thoughts, some sort of violence is going to happen. But probably more important than that, I'm worried about justice, right? In America, we've had a pretty good track record of bringing back. We brought about 24 folks back from repatriated back and faced Article 3 courts. We have a system to do that, and that's no problem. But we're able to do that, one, because we have the Material Support to Terrorism clause, which most countries don't, and allows for the collection of evidence and prosecution in a way you haven't. And the other thing, frankly, is we have smaller numbers of citizens in those camps, right? So it's one thing to ask the US to take back 12 people. It's another thing to ask the French to take back 500. They just don't have the system in place to do so. And they're dealing with a different set of folks left, right? Most of the individuals, with some exceptions, that are left, either you don't have anything to prosecute, so you can't bring a case, or they're hardened believers, right? It's easy when somebody comes back from Syria and says, I had a really bad experience there. Joining ISIS was a really bad idea, and I want to plead guilty, right? It's quite another thing when somebody comes back and says, no, I'm not talking to you, right? You can't really build a case on that. And so you're stuck with this area of, do you let them just kind of go? But I think at the ultimate point is we have a responsibility, right? Our citizens from around the world went to Syria and Iraq and committed war crimes and genocide. And it's incumbent on us to provide some level of justice for those victims. And I think the best way to do that is through criminal prosecutions.
I want to go back to the issue of radicalization, because that story is not over. And a number of experts have made the comparison between radicalization to jihadist terrorism, and radicalization of white nationalists, white supremacists. Do you see these as, crossover in terms of strategies and methods? Obviously, their messaging is different, but where do you see the crossovers, or would you just say, no, these are separate entities, but we need to look at them both from the point of view of how to counter extremism?
There's a couple of things to think about when you look at white supremacist or anti-government movements in general, right? One is tech companies haven't caught up. So if you look at 2015-16 timeframe, Twitter, Google, Facebook, finally kind of a light bulb went off and they decided to do some content moderation and push these guys off to the margins of the internet. They have not done the same thing when it comes to white supremacists and anti-government groups. And so there's relative free reign. As a researcher, that's great because I can reach out to a Boogaloo member right now and ask some questions, right? And I could have done the same thing in ISIS in 2014. But from a general kind of question of radicalization, that's not a great thing to happen right now. The other thing I think it's different is that radicalization kind of in the white supremacist movement, there is an online dynamic, we can't discount it, but there is a large offline dynamic, right? It's easier to load up a bunch of guys in a room to talk about how much you hate the Michigan governor for COVID lockdowns, right? If you try to get a dozen people in a room to talk about how great ISIS is, 9 of them would be FBI agents. That same dynamic does not happen with anti-government extremists at the same kind of clip. And so there's an ability to recruit and raise and set up an organization easier when it comes to those ideologies. The last thing I'd mention is we need to talk really about the mixing of ideologies. It's not as clear cut as it used to be. The good old days, 15, 20 years ago, I could tell you that guy was an Al-Qaeda guy because he listened to that treatise and that radical sheikh, and that would be easy. I could put him in the bucket, or ISIS even, right? Now you're seeing this mixing of, white nationalists who's also an incel, who happens to be a Boogaloo member, who occasionally goes to a Proud Boys meeting. The buckets make it harder. And as government, you really need the buckets because then you can put resources against the buckets, right? I can have a squad that does incel because, we think that's important. But what happens when it mixes back and forth? And also, to come full circle, how do you train up content moderation for technology companies to understand that mixing of ideologies in a way that's easier when it's a black flag, you got to take it down.
One of the things that, is constantly talked about when you think about deterring radicalization in other parts of the world is to talk about the causes that led to that radicalization, whether it's violence, whether it's discrimination, whether it's deprivation of one sort or another. When you're looking at white supremacists in this country, is there a similar narrative about what leads individuals to identify with a militia or a terrorist group? And if so, what is that narrative?
Yeah, I mean, for militias, it's much more of a familial connection, right? Your dad was in the militia, you're in the militia now too. For white nationalists, that I think is where the online space does play a good amount of role and allows for a connection and coordination that you hadn't seen prior, especially the connectivity to it. So it's a little bit of a different dynamic on there. There's a general sense of, and I think the same sense for ISIS, which is a sense of belonging, right? These are usually individuals who aren't particularly great at what they are in real life and want to be part of something bigger. And whether that's white nationalism and a movement like that or ISIS, it provides a sense of belonging that they didn't have before.
I'm going to start, we're getting a ton of questions, so I think I'm just going to go to the questions and I'll just interject myself as they make sense. One asks, I would like to know, as an author on female suicide terrorism, how do we hold accountable in a more comprehensive way the women who inspire the men, such as Omar Mateen and the San Bernardino event, etc.? Just for our listeners, I'm going to, consolidate the questions and shorten them. Talk about female.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting dynamic. When we looked through the cases and we looked through the trial records, I mean, the words brainwash come up a lot for judges when they sentence. In fact, men were sentenced at a much higher, longer sentence than their female counterparts. And so I think the criminal justice system looked at that issue differently. and saw that as women as almost secondhand thoughts and not having agency in this. When in fact, we interviewed a lot of individuals who joined ISIS that were women. They knew what they were doing. They came in there clear-eyed. I think a good takeaway from that would be, a good example of that would be Sam al-Assani was a woman from Indiana who traveled with her husband and her kids to Syria. She had a Yazidi as a slave. She allowed her son to be in an ISIS propaganda video. She was all in from an outsider's perspective. Now, her defense attorney would argue that I'm completely off. But
I'm just going to speak in her defense attorney's voice, but go right ahead.
Yes. They would argue there's a whole host of reasons why she did so, including an abusive husband, and I think that we can't discount that. But I also would say, if you had the same dynamic for a male counterpart that came back, they wouldn't get 6 years that Sam got. And so it's a balancing, and I struggle with that too. As a father of young kids, when I see a kid that looks just like me in an ISIS propaganda video, and think to myself, why would you ever put yourself in a situation that allowed that to happen? There's a level of victimhood of which I think is important, but also can't be overplayed.
On the other hand, if you do follow along the lines of sort of off ramps, that's the kind of thing that you could prevent, right? I mean, in theory, if we did have some kind of robust, you don't even have to call it counterviolent extremism. You just call it, public health, right? Which is why I think the emergence of terrorism in all different forms and of violence in all different forms is sort of a signifier that maybe there are other things going on that we were really paying attention to. And I think some of the CVE work did try to flag some of those issues.
The other thing I would think about too is, you can't think about this in a vacuum too. So, Sam came back with 4 of her kids, right? And so, and the husband is killed or was killed in Syria. And so, are you putting these 4 kids in child protective services? And if so, like, what does that look like? Are you training them up on radicalization and review for a 6-year-old? I mean, there's a whole host of things I think we need to tackle. I would say that of the returning or repatriated individuals, we've got, again, 24 or so. The overwhelming number who were not charged with any crimes were women. And the overwhelming number that weren't charged with crimes that were women, I've interviewed a number of them, and I don't see them having any form of recidivism. I think they saw it as a moment of disillusionment with ISIS and wanted to come back to America.
In a way, it sort of dovetails with criminal justice system need for reforms generally, right? So how we think about criminals and what chances they have for their futures.
One last thing on the role of women, I think is important to look at is the outsized role when they play online. So a number of American women that were ISIS supporters were the key connectors for men to travel. And so they were the nodes online, particularly on Twitter, to connect these individuals to recruiters and sympathizers online to get them over and cross the border in Turkey.
One of the questions is, what can we do to prevent the radicalization of American citizens, ISIS, white terrorists, that's what the writer calls them, American white nationalists. You've given some thought to this. What are the means of not getting to the point where we have to indict, arrest?
Yep. Yeah. So I think first off the bat, we need to assume we're not doing 100% success rate, right? For a counterviolent extremism program, you're hoping for a 10% success rate. That's a win. And I think if we set the bar as we tried a prevention program and it failed and this individual got arrested, that's a failure. I'm not sure that's the right way to think about the framing of this. In terms of what do we do, I would get away from broad-based engagement. So when I was in government, when something bad would happen, they put me on a plane and I'd go to a community center and talk to 300 people about the bombing in Boston and how to prevent the next 2 guys from doing that horrible thing. I felt good about what I was doing, but that wasn't my target audience, right? Those 300 people that showed up to talk to an intelligence officer is not who needs to hear my message. What it really should be doing is one-on-one interventions, right? I've got a kid who I'm worried about. He's spouting his mouth off about how great ISIS is. Who do I know in his orbit that can get him back into the society, right? Who's a mentor I can throw in? Or just generally, what's the roadblocks I can throw in his way so maybe he gets a little bit older and moves on with his life?
This is from a defense attorney, because you brought them up. We have a few. If someone gets in contact with an ISIS recruiter, might he have gone in a different direction, not illegal direction? What is the value of an informant or an undercover induced plots, leaving aside the technical legal issues about entrapment? Isn't that simply creating defendants, or worse, potentially violent individuals who resist or suspect the undercover informant, but perhaps move in that direction independently? In other words, what should the role of law enforcement be, and what has it become? How do you assess
Yeah.
this? And do you think it's changed over time?
I do think it's changed over time. I think the early Al-Qaeda cases with the informants, I think the books can be written about that, the way that was operated. When you look at the 220 plus cases of ISIS related activities and criminal charges in the US, about 55% involved an undercover agent or informant. And so it was a tool the FBI leaned on heavily when it comes to terrorism. Now the FBI would argue, listen, we use informants and undercover agents in all forms of crime, and so it's an agnostic law enforcement tool. But I would say, it did play a significant role in terms of arrests, particularly in the later cases where you don't necessarily have that easy overt act. So if you drive to LaGuardia and your plan is to get on a plane, the fact that you bought a ticket, that's the overt act, and that's material support. That's an arrest, right? But if you can't go to Syria or Iraq because the borders are closed, now you still got an individual who's communicating online. You're still concerned about him. That's when you kind of introduce an informant or undercover agent. I think any defense attorney worth their salt has made that argument about entrapment. Very few have won, but I think it's a valid argument to have that conversation about where is that line between push and pull, and whether the off ramps that you offer are really off ramps, right? It's one thing to say, "Are you sure, brother? Do you really want to join ISIS?" It's another thing to say, "You really shouldn't join ISIS. You should think about something else," right?
Yeah, or here's where you buy the ticket, or
Yeah, right.
right. See, that would they, and the defense in the prosecutor would say in court, well, if I came to you and asked you to buy the ticket, would you say it to the
Right.
jury? I just think, it's yeah. Okay.
I mean, there are some levels of restrictions. I mean, you look at the FBI's DIOG, which is their Bible, right? The Domestic Investigations Oversight Guide. It does provide some right and left latitudes on how you should work an informant. I think, again, my civil rights and civil liberties colleagues would say that we should add more guardrails to that. And I think that's the other takeaway from the book too, is a little sunlight wouldn't kill us on this issue. The fact that I had to pull teeth to get people to talk to me about terrorism and counterterrorism, I had to call in a lot of favors, get on a plane, pigeonhole people at a coffee shop or a bar and talk about this. I still don't have the full sense of what ISIS in America looks like. And I think that's true not only of the threat, but also just how we do operations. And some of the secrecy is completely understandable when you're dealing with national security. But I think it's incumbent on a democracy to have a bit of a show how we do it.
And the chances of that happening are?
Slim to none.
Okay. Well, you never know.
I hope it springs eternal for me.
Okay, the questions are mounting. Why are we not debunking religious ideology that underpins ISIS? It's very easy to do that, given it's impossible for anyone to know more about Islam and Muhammad and the role of Muhammad. Why aren't we going down this road?
Yeah, one is the government's not well suited to do so, and two, I don't think they should. I mean, you have an establishment clause issue that would hit you right across the face as soon as you tried to do that. But just in general, I think the more poignant part is the government just not well suited to do so. Like, you're not going to debate the finer points of Said Qutb with a recruit, right? It's just not going to happen. And so then it becomes a responsibility for civil society, right? What are the NGO groups that can do that type of stuff? Now, there are a roadblock to that, right? One is funding, right? There's not a dedicated funding for this. Two, if there is dedicated funding, it's government funding. And if you take the government funding, does that make you less effective? And three, and I think probably the most important one now is why? Like, why would you jump into this space right now? I interviewed an imam from Virginia who was thinking about doing counter messaging online, and a guy who kind of well steeped in the faith and could debate the finer points of it. But he was like, I'm not going to do that, because as soon as I talk to a known or suspected terrorist, I'm going to get watch listed for the rest of my life, right? And so there's an easy solution to that, which is to provide a system for basic alerts, right? Nobody's going to jam me up at LaGuardia because I interviewed an ISIS recruiter in Raqqa. I've got a history, I've got a business card. I hope I don't get on a watch list. But the same is not true for a random NGO in Indiana who's trying to do this work. And so if we can figure out some level of kind of alert system, or at the very least, a guidepost of what is illegal and not illegal to do. The material support terrorism clause is very broad, right? I think back to 2 years ago, I got a Twitter DM from a woman in the Midwest who wanted me to send her every criminal complaint I had of women traveling because she didn't want to get arrested traveling, right? She wanted to read the playbook and figure out the ways around it. Now, that is, I know well enough to know not to do that. But you ask somebody else who hasn't been around and been interviewing ISIS folks that's not a great idea. I think that's asking a bit of much than we currently do.
Another question. Have you seen any cooperation, direct or indirect, between jihadist groups and domestic extreme groups of the right or left, white supremacists, etc.?
No, not really, of any real substance. Now, here's the interesting caveat. You sometimes see it on the government side. And so that would be a good example. That would be the Boogaloo guys in Minnesota who got arrested for gun charges, but they got charged with material support to terrorism. The material support was they were selling guns to a Hamas operative, right? The Hamas operative was an FBI agent. And so the FBI introduced the informant as a Hamas agent because then he could charge against material support. But I think the takeaway is, one, I think the statute hasn't caught up to the nature of the threat, but also two, these guys are generally agnostic on ideology, or at least, if somebody wants to watch the world burn, they're okay with joining up on the fire.
One person asked, you commented, if you get enough people in a room who are extremists, violence will happen.
Yep.
What are the chances when the room is online or social media? Yeah,
that's a real question, especially when you look at the white nationalist movement. A lot of talk and not necessarily a whole lot of action quite yet. Now, ask me again in a few weeks, right? But yeah, I think, is some of this like a bluster, right? Is it a releasing of a valve of extremism so you can move on and say, I tweeted the best I could, brothers, I'm done, right? That is also the dynamic that the FBI has to deal with on a daily basis, right? When is somebody just spouting their mouth off, and when is it a full field investigation? They would say when that individual has connections to known or suspected terrorists overseas, or when they make overt actions, whether that be buying a gun or looking up recipes to build a bomb, that's when you start turning on the spigot.
Do you get the sense that the FBI has really deployed its agents away from jihadist terrorism and towards white supremacist terrorism?
Yes.
How do we know this?
What?
How do we know this? What are
Yeah, so a number of the FBI agents I interviewed for the book on ISIS don't work ISIS anymore. They work anti-government stuff.
And do they talk about similarities that they see or differences that they see? How do they?
Yeah, I mean, listen, they find it to be almost easier of a case, right? Because these guys are so overt in a ways that the jihadists were a little bit better at hiding their tracks a little bit with encrypted apps and things like that. The white supremacists don't necessarily see a need to do that quite yet. I would also say that the tempo for ISIS cases has significantly dropped within the bureaus. So, in 2015, you had FBI agents I was interviewing would say they would work 18-hour days and wouldn't see their family for weeks and would cancel family picnics at the Washington field office to work cases. They'll now say I'm rested a little bit more, right? It's still out there. I'm still dealing with the issues, but it's a different dynamic. One other thing to look out for that different dynamic is the charges. So some in the FBI leadership would argue that the tempo hasn't dropped too much, but what has changed is we're kicking cases earlier on. So we're arresting individuals for false statements to the FBI or gun charges or drug charges. And before that, we would have let it build up a little bit to a material support to terrorism case. And so they'll say, there's only been a dozen cases about, but there's 24 more you don't, because we don't put the word ISIS when we arrest a guy for gun charges. That's what I'm talking about when we say we don't have a full picture of ISIS in America yet. And that's going to take quite a bit to do so. I will say to my colleagues in law enforcement, I'm still looking. And so I'm going to find the cases because we're just diggers by our very nature and we're investigators. And so I think it would, again, incumbent on us as a democracy to share as much information as we possibly can, if only so we can get a sense of the nature of the threat and then can put our resources against it. You know, do we have $100 million toward ISIS and $200 million to white supremacists, or is that number even? And I don't know that we know that in the public realm.
Do you know it about Europe?
Yeah, I mean, Europol, the head of Europol has said that they're looking at about 50-50 cases when it comes to jihadism and white supremacist. And so that dynamic has shifted from 90-10 to 50-50 now. And I think that's true of most law enforcement in Western countries is it's just coming at them at all angles now. It's almost a little bit easier when someone makes the overt act to travel versus what they're looking at now, which is, you know, ideologies all over the space.
Well, somebody asked, following up on that, how do you view the recent attacks in France? Do you see them as part of a broader resurgence or as a unique fallout of France's approach to its larger Muslim population?
I think there's dynamics in France that we can't discount, but I would say, you know, look at Austria too. It is a different dynamic in Europe than it is in America. For the most part in America, you didn't have, you don't have people handing out leaflets in Times Square about how great the caliphate was, right? You did see that dynamic happen in Birmingham with Sharia for UK. And so the overt nature of recruitment, I think, is different. To be fair to in the US, with some notable exceptions, and those being quite few, there's not extreme mosques where people are talking about how great ISIS is and things like that. You know, if you walked into a mosque and talked about how great ISIS is, you know, you would summarily be kicked out of the mosque and have to go down the street and go pray by yourself, right? There's just not a level of acceptance there. That's not to say there's a large scale acceptance in Europe, but it's just a little bit different than here.
A couple of people have asked about the foreign fighters returning, which you mentioned before, but I think in a different sense. I mean, this is something that Europe confronts much more than the United States confronts. And I don't necessarily mean those who come back, you know, in custody, but those who actually come back. How do you see this? Do you see this as something that can be managed? Do you think this is something that can be turned around? Do you think this is something that we really need to be vigilant about, but no more than that? How do you, and I'm talking about Europe now, more than here. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think Europe is a managing problem, much more. I mean, look, the wave of folks that traveled to Syria and Iraq had connections to conflicts in the 90s too, the sons and fathers of that conflict, right? So in many ways, the guys that go to Syria become the bug lights for the next conflict, right? They've got the bona fides to do so for it. Now in America, we're a lot better off in terms of most of our folks that came back disillusioned and disenchanted with their time in ISIS. Only one of the cases we know about where an individual came back with the expressed plan to commit an attack, a man from Ohio who was going to drive to Texas and with a bunch of his buddies and try to free a convicted terrorist. But most of our folks tend to come back disillusioned.
A couple of the questions are about the digital space, the digital battle space, as one of our audience writes. What do you think? Are we playing catch up in the digital battle space when it comes to ISIS and other terrorist groups? And I want to further add this is there really, what do you see that can be done that isn't a violation of constitutional principles, First Amendment, et cetera?
Yeah, I think we've largely, done all we can on the mainstream sites when it comes to ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and jihadism. You know, Facebook, Twitter, they've got more analysts than the FBI has agents working on content moderation, and so they've largely been moved. At least the English language scene for ISIS has largely been moved to Telegram, which provides a level of encryption and ease of use, but it's not particularly great in terms of encryption. And so the radicalization pool has shrunk, and by that I mean, like, you can't just stumble upon an ISIS recruiter on Twitter like you could in 2014 if you were just searching for what was going on with Assad and the barrel bombs, right? And so that makes it a little bit easier to make sure that fence sitters don't just stumble upon it. But the mobilization pool got deeper in Telegram. So the folks that are left on Telegram are true believers through and through, and they're only hearing the voices they want to hear. And there's no dissenting voices in that conversation. So I think we're probably in the best space we could be for the online kind of jihadist sphere. That is I would have a completely different assessment when it comes to anti-government and white supremacist movements. When it comes to mainstream sites, I think we're still in the 2014 timeframe for that.
Which means what?
Which means it's wild, wild west. You can do whatever you want and no one's going to stop you. And if they do, it's just because enough people had flagged it. It's not proactive scanning against it. We can put aside, there's a debate to be had about, and I share this view very strongly. I don't really like that private multi-billion-dollar companies take an inherently governmental role of counterterrorism, which we basically ceded the space to private companies to do so. And that concerns me because then they set the standards of it. And so we may want to consider looking at that like a public utility. Now they would hate me for that, but I'll just go ahead and say it. But I don't like ceding that space to it. I think we have. Think back to Jim Clapper getting on a plane to Silicon Valley and having a meeting with Eric Schmidt about, wouldn't it be great if you took down more content? That seems like a pretty an adjunctation of your responsibilities, right? There's got to be something a little bit stronger than we can do, but we haven't figured it out yet.
Right, and either way, there are issues at stake, right? Both in terms of giving the government too much power and in terms of giving the private sector too much power. And so maybe we need a third voice, which would be what I call the citizens getting to weigh in with maybe how this should all play out. But that's for another conversation. I want to talk about, we're about to get a new government, we think. We're going to get a lot of new people in positions that you've interacted with in the past. We're going to get a new head of NCTC. We'll get a new DNI, et cetera. If you were at NCTC and you were going to make a list of recommendations for how to go about this in a way that is responsible and that is, to your opening earlier remarks, more transparent, and that is aware of civil liberties issues, what would your assessment be? Would it be, let's understand that this is just another brand of criminal justice and treat it that way, and maybe pull back on some of the uses of informants, et cetera? Do you think it's important to show that as even, as here we're going to move in that direction, and we want to symbolically show that, and so go out of your way to show that there's been a change of approach? How would you prioritize what needs to be done, and what do you think needs to be done?
I wouldn't mess with the NCTC too much. I think of the post 9/11 reforms, I'm a NCTC lifer, right? I spent 5 years there. But I also spent 5 years at DNI, and I would reform the hell out of that, right? So for NCTC, I think I wouldn't touch too much in terms of it. There's a few things I would do, right? I think a level of transparency on the terrorism watch list screening system, I think would be useful for not only the public, but also civil rights, civil liberties organizations that have been harping on that for quite a while. The other thing I would significantly look at would be an expansion of the role of NCTC to look at domestic terrorism. Right now, in a statute, they can look at international terrorism, and the lawyers say you can kind of look at domestic terrorism, but not really too much. Like, you can get in the shallow end, but don't go anywhere near the deep end, right? And I think we should be able to go in the deep end as long as we set up structures to prevent us from drowning, right? And so I think that the tools are available and the processes are available to share information between, say, FBI, DHS, and other organizations, with NCTC being the honest broker in between. And so I would look at that significantly. For DNI, this is going to be a really interesting time for the Biden administration, right? Do they look at DNI as the need to have a strong player in there with a strong voice who kind of coordinates the intelligence community? Or do we look at them more as like a friendly gatekeeper who occasionally opens the door, right? I'm not really sure, based on the landing team, where they fall on it. And I'm not really sure anyone really knows where they fall on it quite yet. But I think it'll be a great debate in terms of intelligence reform post 2004.
We've gotten a bunch more questions, so let me just first follow up with that and just say, I do think there's going to be some rethinking about some of these agencies, including DHS, including DNI. You might be right about NCTC. It puts us in a very weird position because too much Too much change may be more than we can handle. On the other hand, there does need to be some restructuring, I think, along the lines of what you were saying and maybe more. Here's a question. What are the implications when those arrested in these cases are released from prison? There's a number of individuals who are getting out, mostly Al-Qaeda guys from 2005, 2006 convictions, and some others. And how do you feel about that? There's been, I'm sure you've seen the headlines and the articles, you've seen the cases where they've said, we're going to keep this person, if they're not an American citizen, in custody, and then in ICE custody, and then, hopefully maybe deport them. Why should these be any different? Let me ask this in a more pointed way. Why should they be any different than anybody else in the criminal justice system who's gotten out of prison after serving the term that they've been given? Or should we just see them in the light of the broader swath of criminal justice?
Yeah, the question reminds me a lot of I interviewed a couple of probation officers for this book, and a lot of them said, why am I giving special treatment to someone who wanted to kill me versus somebody who has a drug problem who spent 20 years in jail? Shouldn't I spend my limited resources towards that problem? Then why does somebody who's a terrorist get special treatment on this? Yeah, I think we should talk about that at some point, but I'm not sure I believe all of that. I would say, listen, terrorism is a form of crime, right? Full stop. And so crime has a level of recidivism just built into it. We have seen just in limited studies that terrorism recidivism is much smaller than general crime populations. And so we haven't seen that much recidivism on this. We have seen a few. Like a good example would be John Georgelis from Texas, who was arrested for defacing the AIPAC website with a number of pro-Hamas comments. And then when he got out, 6 months later, he got on a plane and became a pretty high-level commander in ISIS, right? So that's the level of recidivism. I would say that I've interviewed a lot of...
Or maybe radicalization because of how, how he viewed, how he was treated. Who knows, right?
That's entirely possible. I would say that, of the individuals that have gotten out post-ISIS, because a lot of these individuals got charged with false statements. So that's a 5 to 8 year, depending on the terrorism enhancement. A lot of these individuals got out. I've interviewed a good number of them. Most of them, I think, are happy to move on with their lives. And so it reminds me of somebody I interviewed from New York who was in Al-Qaeda, who, I wouldn't say he was de-radicalized, but I definitely say he was disengaged. I asked him would he ever join back up, and he said, my back hurts, I'm too old, right? That's not necessarily de-radicalization, it's disengagement, right? And that's perfectly legal in this country, right? The one last thing that I would look at is, here's my overarching concern. Let's say someone gets out of jail and commits an attack. There's going to be congressional hearings, and the congressional hearings are going to drag up the FBI director, whoever that may be, and say, this guy was a convicted terrorist. Why didn't you stop him when he got out of jail? And the short answer is there wasn't a predicate, right? You can't open a full field investigation for a convicted terrorist who gets out of jail if they haven't committed an overt act. But from a public perception, you would say, why the hell didn't you watch this guy forever? I don't think we have the resources to put 4 men and women in a van running 24-hour shifts on everybody who gets out of jail. I think it's a waste of resources. But I also think that we haven't coordinated it. So U.S. Attorney, probation officers, Bureau of Prisons, they're not singing from the same sheet right now. You don't really train up the probation officer on what they should look at when they do a no-knock check-in. Are they looking for a religious book? They shouldn't be, but have we trained them not to? Are they looking for an ISIS flag, and do they know what an ISIS flag looks like? I mean, these are things these kind of baseline things we haven't done in any real substance.
And in terms of, release, what happened to the programs of the late 20th century that were reintegration programs and rehabilitation programs and that can be used across the criminal justice board and not just, in terms of terrorists, which again are within this category of criminals. So do you see any hope for more robust programs along those lines?
I don't. This is where my hope does not spring eternal. I think largely because the numbers are relatively small. We'll have about 85 individuals who get out in the next 2 years for terrorism-related activities, right? And you spread that across 94 different U.S. attorneys' offices, and that number gets very small. And so you don't have these large-scale programs that you can kind of use against, one guy who gets out in Chicago. I talked to a man who was in Al-Shabaab for a while and got out, and he wants to go pray at his mosque, but his mosque doesn't want to have anything to do with him because he's a convicted terrorist, right? They don't want the heat that involves on that. And so he's got no social fabric or safety to kind of help him out along the way. I don't know how to solve that, but I just know it's a problem.
A couple of people have asked a question which is not exactly in your expertise, but I have to ask it anyway because it's in mine,
Yes.
which is Guantanamo.
Yep.
We chose not to, the country chose not to bring the individuals charged with crimes from Guantanamo to the United States for a variety of reasons we don't have to go into. Do you see any hope in the future? Congress's ban on bringing those people here in terms of the appetite of the criminal justice system to make that happen? And do you think there were enough people in government from when you were there who were thinking that way, that are still thinking that way, that this is a possibility going forward?
I find that most practitioners, would tend towards Article 3 courts, just because it works, right? There's a history of being able to do so. There's a classification, declassification system that is not great, but also not broken, right? And so we have a track record to be able to do this. Am I hopeful? Yes, and I'll explain why. I don't think we scare as easily as we used to, just because the nature of the news cycle now, we just kind of move on with whatever happened that day. And so we brought back, again, 24 people from overseas who were in ISIS. We put them through federal courts, and it wasn't even a 3-paragraph story in the Associated Press anymore. Right? You're not having these giant press conferences about this. In fact, we've gotten so good at it, we're taking other citizens. Right? We took 2 British citizens to prosecute them for crimes against Americans in the Eastern District of Virginia. And then nobody said to themselves, why did we do that? It just made sense, right? So I'm hopeful for that. The problem is the remaining 40 or so in Gitmo is, you've got a decade of fits and starts and information and torture and everything wrapped in together, and that's just it gets very dirty very quickly to try to move them into federal courts.
But it could happen. I'm hearing from you, but it could happen.
Yes, you're telling me there's a chance. Yes.
Thank you. I was going to ask you for a hopeful question, for a hopeful, thought, which is how we always end our events. But do you have any other to add besides that? I'll take that.
I think the real takeaway from the book is that we're not talking about a large-scale phenomenon. It's interesting, and the reason why me and my colleagues wrote the book is because we find humans by their very nature complex, and the reason why they join terrorist organizations equally complex. And so we wanted to answer that question. What we took away from it was relatively small phenomenon, and ISIS had to really have a perfect hand to be able to recruit an unprecedented number of Americans. And so we're probably going to go back to the ages of the 20 and 30 cases a year for the short term, with the occasional attack here and there. But I think we're probably in a better place than we were 10 years ago on this.
Well, I suggest that everybody read this book. Before we go, I just want to say a few things about what's coming up at the center. We have a few new interesting podcasts coming out, Vital Interest Podcast. Also, we have a couple of reports coming out. One is a report on terrorism, on the terror crime nexus in America by our NYPD fellow, Rafael Marcus. And it's kind of like what you're saying. The takeaway is there's something there, but it's not what we might have imagined it to be. And this report focuses to some extent on the comparison with Europe, where there actually is more of a crime terror nexus. And it's a terrific report. And we have 2 more COVID reports coming out that are comparing countries around the world. And in our next 2 reports, you'll be seeing Taiwan, Italy, Sweden, Brazil, Iran, India, and Vietnam. So we've been doing a lot of research here. Seamus, I think Seamus Hughes, everybody should read this book, Homegrown. Thank you all for your questions, and have a safe Thanksgiving. We'll see you on the other side of it. Thank you, Seamus.
Thank you.